January 1944. High above the Bismarck Sea, a B-24 Liberator claws through thin clouds, its 4 engines vibrating the cold air into a constant metallic tremor. Inside the fuselage, the smell of oil, cordite, and sweat hangs thick. The aircraft is already scarred, patched aluminum, streaked exhaust, chipped paint from flak that came too close on earlier missions. In the waist section, a single gunner braces himself against the open hatch. The wind tears at his oxygen mask. Below him, the ocean glitters like broken glass. Above him, the sky is empty, too empty. That is usually when they come. He checks his ammunition belt one last time. It doesn't look right. Anyone trained by the book would notice it instantly. The sequence is wrong. The colors are wrong. The pattern violates everything taught in gunnery school. A stupid mistake, some would say. A careless one. A fatal one, but the gunner doesn't correct it. He locks the charging handle forward, steadies his breathing, and waits, because he has learned something the manuals never taught. Something about how men see, how pilots react, and how fear travels faster than bullets, and in a few moments. The sky will prove him right. By early 1944. The Pacific War had entered a grinding middle phase. The shock of Pearl Harbor had long since hardened into routine violence, and the desperate improvisation of 1942 had given way to industrialized killing on a scale the Pacific had never known. The United States was no longer fighting to survive, it was fighting to advance. Island by island, airstrip by airstrip, reef by reef. The center of that advance was air power. The Pacific was too vast for artillery dominance and too hostile for traditional land warfare alone. Control of the air meant control of supply lines, amphibious landings, and the tempo of the war itself. Long-range bombers became floating artillery platforms, capable of reaching Japanese strongholds scattered across thousands of miles of ocean. Among them was the consolidated B-24 Liberator. The B-24 was not loved the way the B-17 was. It was faster, had longer range, and carried more bombs, but it was also unforgiving. Its Davis wing gave it speed at the cost of stability. Its high-altitude performance was excellent on paper, brutal in practice. The aircraft demanded precision from its crew and punished hesitation. In the Pacific, the B-24 became indispensable, unlike Europe, where massed formations flew predictable corridors over Germany. Pacific bombers often operated in smaller groups, sometimes alone, over vast empty water. They struck shipping lanes, airfields, oil facilities, and jungle-covered bases. Missions stretched 10, 12, sometimes 14 hours. There was no place to land if something went wrong, and there was always something that went wrong. Japanese air defense evolved quickly. Early war dogfighting tactics gave way to disciplined interception methods. Fighters like the Mitsubishi A6M0, Nakajima Ki-43, and later the Ki-84 Hay-8 adapted to bomber interception roles. They learned the blind spots. They learned the approach angles. They learned patience. By 1943, Japanese pilots were no longer charging head-on in suicidal arcs. They attacked from below, from the rear quarter, from climbing spirals where defensive fire was weakest. They used cloud cover. They coordinated in pairs. Some carried 20mm cannons that could shred aluminum with a single hit for bomber crews. The sky became a 3-dimensional ambush. The U.S. Army Air Forces responded by emphasizing defensive firepower. A typical B-24 bristled with up to 10.50 caliber machine guns, nose, top turret, ball turret, waist, and tail. In theory, overlapping fields of fire created a protective sphere. In practice, that sphere had seams, and Japanese pilots learned exactly where they were. Training manuals were precise. Gunners were taught controlled bursts. 3 to 5 rounds. Aim ahead. Lead the target. Watch the traces. Correct your fire. Traces were the teacher. Bright red or orange streaks that showed where rounds were going. They were supposed to guide aim, build confidence, and conserve ammunition. But traces worked both ways. A Japanese pilot closing at 300 miles per hour, tracer fire was a roadmap. It showed where the guns were pointing, where the bullets weren't, and where the bomber's blind spots lived. Experienced pilots learned to ride the spaces between streams of light, and there was another problem. Gunners were young. Many were barely out of high school. They trained stateside with calm instructors and predictable target toes. Combat erased that calm in seconds. When fighters attacked, adrenaline took over. Trigger discipline vanished. Ammunition vanished with it. A standard .50 caliber ammunition box could empty in under 30 seconds of continuous fire, and once it was gone. That gun was dead weight. This was the environment in which one particular waste gunner flew, a man whose name would never appear in grand strategy briefings or war room maps, but whose choices would ripple through a single bomber crew and echo far beyond it. He was not an ace, not an officer, not a tactician, just a man wedged between aluminum ribs, staring through plexiglass at a sky that wanted him dead. And somewhere between his first mission and his last, he began to notice something others didn't. A pattern in the way enemy fighters reacted. A hesitation. A moment of confusion, not in the machine, but in the man flying it. It was a realization born not of theory, but of survival, and it would lead him to do something that, on paper, made absolutely no sense, something no instructor would ever approve, something that would quietly make him one of the deadliest gunners in the Pacific. The man in the waist position did not come from a lineage of warriors or aviators. Like most aircrew in the Pacific, he was ordinary before the war, factory work, farm labor, or a small-town trade that offered stability but little distinction. When the draft notice came, it was not glory he imagined, but distance. Distance from home, from routine, from the narrow paths already laid out for him. He entered the Army Air Forces through the same funnel as thousands of others. Basic training first, then classification. When the aptitude tests came back, they pointed him toward gunnery. Good eyesight, steady hands, mechanical calm under pressure. Gunnery school was efficient, mechanical, and deeply standardized. Recruits learned ballistics before they learned fear. They memorized lead angles. They memorized engagement envelopes. They fired at towed sleeves dragged across clean blue skies. Hits were counted. Misses were corrected. Everything was orderly, but nothing in training resembled combat. The targets didn't shoot back. The sky was never crowded. The aircraft never bucked under flak. No one screamed over the intercom. No engine ever coughed. And most importantly, ammunition was unlimited. Instructors taught a single doctrine: short, controlled bursts using tracer rounds to walk fire onto the target. Tracers were loaded in predictable ratios, usually one tracer for every 4 or 5 ball rounds. This allowed gunners to see their stream and correct their aim without wasting ammunition. On paper, it was sound. In reality, it was calm when he arrived in the Pacific. That assumption shattered almost immediately. His first combat missions were long, monotonous flights broken by seconds of terror, hours of nothing, then sudden violence. Fighters appearing like insects out of the sun. The airframe was shaking. The sound of rounds tearing through metal. The smell of cordite and hot oil mixing in the fuselage. He watched experienced gunners panic. He felt it himself, the instinct to hold the trigger down, to spray the sky and hope something intersected with the bullets. Ammunition disappeared faster than logic allowed. What disturbed him most was what he saw before the shooting started. Enemy fighters didn't rush in blindly. They watched. They waited. They studied the bomber's defenses. When tracer fire appeared, it told them everything. Where the guns were pointed. Where they were not. How quickly the gunner corrected. Whether he panicked, tracers were not just guidance, they were information, and information traveled both ways. On one mission over the northern New Guinea coast, a Japanese fighter approached from low and behind, easing upward in a shallow climb. The gunner tracked him, fired a short burst. The tracers arced too high. The fighter dipped calmly beneath them and fired back. The gunner survived. Another man in the aircraft did not. That moment stayed with him. Between missions, he began watching the ammunition belts more closely. Watching how the red-orange beads of tracer appeared in predictable intervals. Watching how pilots reacted to them. How they flinched. How they adjusted. And he began to wonder something that training manuals never addressed. What if the tracers were lying? Not malfunctioning, but misleading on purpose. He noticed that when tracers appeared, enemy pilots reacted instantly. They broke off or shifted trajectory. When no tracers appeared, they often hesitated, uncertain whether they were being fired upon or merely watched. This observation sat quietly in his mind, growing heavier with each mission. He did not speak about it at first. Questioning doctrine in wartime was not encouraged. Deviating from standard loadouts could be grounds for discipline. Ammunition belts were inspected. Procedures were sacred, but in the Pacific, rules bent under heat and distance. Crews maintained their own aircraft. They loaded their own belts. Supervision was thin, especially on forward fields carved out of jungle and coral, and so, between missions, he began experimenting, not recklessly. Methodically, he adjusted the order of rounds, reduced tracer frequency, sometimes removed altogether for certain segments. Other times he clustered them in ways no manual prescribed. It looked wrong to anyone else. It would have looked like a mistake, but to him, it was a question, a hypothesis waiting to be tested at 30,000 feet. With Japanese fighters closing fast, a gamble made not for heroism, but for survival, and soon, the sky would answer. Fear in the air was not a scream. It was a pressure, a tightening behind the eyes, a dryness in the mouth that no amount of water could fix. For bomber gunners, fear was not tied to a single moment but stretched across hours. The long climb, the steady drone of engines, the endless blue, and then the sudden knowledge that somewhere beyond the curvature of the cockpit glass, someone else was watching. By the time a fighter appeared, the body had already been preparing for minutes without conscious thought. Hands trembled, breath shortened, muscles locked. Most men responded the same way: fire early, fire often. Fire until the belt ran. It was instinctive, primitive. Survival boiled down to noise and motion. Make the sky hostile. Fill it with metal, hope the attacker flinched first. But the gunner at the waist began to notice something else. He noticed that panic was visible. That fear broadcasts itself through behavior. Traces arcing wildly told a story. Long streams of fire told another. They revealed hesitation, inexperience, desperation, and Japanese pilots, especially by 1943, had learned how to read those stories. They waited for fear to announce itself. Fatigue played its part too. Missions stretched longer as the war pushed outward. Men flew 5, 6, 7 hours before seeing a target. Adrenaline spiked and crashed. Hands numbed from cold. Oxygen masks bit into faces. Judgment dulled. Under those conditions, discipline eroded. And once discipline eroded, predictability followed. This gunner saw that pattern repeating. And he understood that predictability was death. On paper, American bomber defense was a masterpiece of overlapping fire. Each gun position covered another. Each approach vector was theoretically lethal. But doctrine assumed coordination. In practice, coordination was fragile, communications were limited. Intercoms crackled. Turbulence disrupted aim. A sudden evasive maneuver by the pilot could throw off every gunner at once. The waist gunners, in particular, were vulnerable. Exposed positions. Limited arcs. No armor to speak of. They relied heavily on mutual support and clear firing lanes, yet in real engagements, those firing lanes often collapsed. When one gunner opened fire early, others followed instinctively. The sky filled with traces, but not with control. Instead of a wall, it became a scatter. The enemy slipped between the streams. Japanese pilots adapted to this quickly. They learned to read the net. They waited for bursts, then slid into the gaps. They aimed for engines, cockpits, or control surfaces, firing short, lethal bursts before peeling away. The gunner began to understand that the problem was not firepower. It was information. Every tracer was a message, and the message was too clear. The Browning M2.50 caliber machine gun was a masterpiece of reliability, air-cooled, belt-fed, capable of sustained fire. It was feared for good reason, but it was not magic. It overheated. It was jammed. And when fed continuously, it burned through ammunition at an alarming rate. A standard ammo box held roughly 400 to 500 rounds. At a rate of fire around 750 rounds per minute, a careless gunner could exhaust it in under a minute. Tracers made up a portion of that belt, usually 1 in 5. They burned brightly, but they also burned out after a few hundred yards. Beyond that, they vanished. At long ranges, tracers lied. They dropped faster than ball ammunition. They curved differently. They told the eye one story while the bullet flew another. Experienced gunners knew this in theory. Few had the calm to exploit it. The gunner in the waist did. He began thinking not in terms of hitting the enemy, but in terms of shaping what the enemy saw. He realized that by altering the pattern of traces, spacing them irregularly, clustering them, or removing them entirely for long stretches, he could control the information flowing toward the attacking pilot. He could make the sky lie. Japanese fighter pilots were not suicidal automatons. By 1943 to 44, many were veterans. Survivors. Men who had learned hard lessons over Guadalcanal, Rabaul, and the Solomons. They knew American bombers were dangerous. They also knew they could be beaten. They studied gunners. They studied patterns. They learned to tell a green crew from a veteran one in seconds. A steady stream of traces meant discipline. Erratic bursts meant panic. No traces at all often meant inexperience or a trap. They trusted their eyes more than their instruments, and that trust could be exploited when a gun remained silent. Pilots assumed the gunner hadn't seen them, or that the gun had jammed, or that the arc was dead. Those assumptions created openings measured in heartbeats. The gunner began to design those heartbeats so he was no longer reacting, he was setting the tempo, and in doing so, he was stepping beyond doctrine into something far more dangerous, a personal method of war. 1. That would soon be tested under the worst possible conditions. Improvisation in combat is often romanticized after the fact. At the moment, it feels like disobedience. Like stepping off a ledge without knowing how far the fall will be. For the waist gunner, the decision was not dramatic. It was incremental. A small deviation during one mission. A slight adjustment during the next. A deliberate reordering of ammunition that would have earned a reprimand if noticed. He began by reducing traces to near invisibility. One tracer buried deep within a long belt of ball rounds. Sometimes one every 15. Sometimes none at all until the final quarter of the belt. To anyone inspecting casually, the belt looked normal. To anyone flying against it, it was deeply misleading. Enemy pilots had been trained to react to visible fire. Remove that signal, and their instincts betray them. The first time it worked, the result was almost subtle. A fighter approached from below and behind, closing in at a shallow angle. The gunner tracked him silently. No tracer. No flash. No warning. The fighter continued its approach, confident. Then the gunner fired. The first round struck before the pilot even realized he was under fire. The fighter rolled violently and disappeared downward in a trail of smoke. There was no celebration. Only a quiet realization. This wasn't luck. From that moment, the gunner refined his method. He learned how long he could wait before opening fire. He learned the distance at which a fighter could no longer evade once bullets were already in the air. He learned how to make silence more frightening than noise. His ammunition belts became tools of deception. In some belts, traces appeared late, giving the illusion of poor aim before suddenly snapping into lethal precision. In others, they appeared early, encouraging pilots to break away from empty air while the real danger came from a different gun. He never told the crew exactly what he was doing. Not because he was hiding it, but because it was difficult to explain without sounding unhinged. He simply said, "Trust me." There was a cost to this method, and it wasn't mechanical. To use it effectively required patience. It required letting the enemy come closer than felt safe. It meant delaying fire while another human being closed the distance, unaware of what awaited him. That delay created a moral tension that standard doctrine avoided. Most gunners fired to feel safe. This gunner fired to be lethal. He had to watch pilots die in his sights, sometimes close enough to see faces, because that was the price of certainty. After missions, he rarely spoke. When he did, it was not about kills or counts. It was about timing, about seconds, about moments when he almost fired too early and ruined the entire equation. The rest of the crew noticed the change. They noticed that fighters seemed to fall away from his side of the aircraft more often. They noticed fewer hits on the fuselage near his station. They noticed that when his gun finally spoke, it spoke with finality. They didn't ask how did I in wartime. Effectiveness silences questions. Command never formally endorsed his method. Official doctrine did not change. But no one stopped him either. Results traveled faster than paperwork. Other gunners began experimenting quietly. Tracer ratios shifted across crews. Some copied his approach without fully understanding it. Some failed and reverted to doctrine. But the seed had been planted. In the skies over the Pacific, information became a weapon as sharp as steel. And the gunner, once just another man in a waist position, had become something else, an anomaly inside a machine built on uniformity. A man fighting not just with bullets, but with expectation. And soon, that quiet experiment would be tested under the worst possible conditions. A full-scale interception, multiple fighters, no room to run. The moment when theory either collapses or proves itself beyond doubt. The airfield was still dark when the engines started coughing to life, one by one, until the entire strip vibrated like a living thing. The briefing had been short and grim. A strike deep into enemy-held territory. Heavy opposition expected. Long flight time. No fighter escort for the final leg. For the crew, It was another red circle on the map. Another long haul over water where rescue was theoretical at best. The B-24 lifted heavy, fuel-laden, slow to climb. As the coastline fell away behind them, the aircraft settled into its long cruise, engines droning with mechanical indifference. Inside, the men checked gear, oxygen lines, and intercoms. Jokes were minimal. Everyone sensed it would be a hard one. By mid-morning, the first signs appeared. Black specks against the pale blue horizon. The call came over the intercom, tight, controlled, but unmistakable. Bandits. 5 o'clock low. Multiple. The formation tightened instinctively. The gunners moved into position. Turrets rotated. Fingers hovered near triggers. The waist gunner slid his ammunition box into place. He had prepared it the night before, quietly, methodically. The belt looked normal. It wasn't. He checked the feed. Seated the first round. Locked the charging handle forward. Then he waited. The fighters came in low, using the sun to mask their approach. Zeros, light, agile, and deadly in close quarters. They fanned outward, searching for weakness. A different gunner fired first. Traces slashed across the sky, bright and urgent. The Japanese pilots reacted instantly, splitting, diving, rolling away from the arcs of fire. But 2 of them didn't break as expected. They stayed low, steady, sliding in beneath the fuselage toward the waist. The gunner tracked them through the open hatch. His heart rate climbed, but his hand stayed steady. The distance closed. 300 yards. 200. Still he didn't fire. The lead fighter's canopy flashed in the sun. The pilot was close enough now that the gunner could see the aircraft's nose art, a faded emblem painted just below the cockpit. This was the moment doctrine screamed against. Fire now. Fire before it's too late. He didn't. At 100 yards, the fighter began to climb, lining up its shot. That was the instant. The gunner squeezed the trigger. No warning. No tracer. No visible path of fire. The first impact struck the engine cowling. The second tore through the fuselage. The third ignited fuel. The fighter rolled violently, smoke pouring from its belly, then dropped away in a spiraling fall toward the sea. The second aircraft hesitated, just long enough. That hesitation was fatal. The gunner shifted slightly and fired again. This time, traces appeared late in the burst, bright and sudden, as if the gun had only just come alive. The second fighter broke hard, too late to escape the stream. Its wing sheared, and it vanished beneath the bomber in a flash of debris. Inside the B-24, there was a moment of stunned quiet. Then shouting. Voices overlapping. Someone laughed in disbelief. Another cursed. The intercom crackled with fragmented reports. Hits confirmed, fighters disengaging, more contacts forming up. But something had changed. The next wave approached differently. They stayed farther out. They probed cautiously. They fired from longer range. They treated the waist position as if it were alive, watching them. The gunner had altered the psychology of the fight. As the engagement intensified, he repeated the pattern. Silence. Wait. Fire only when the geometry was perfect. By the time the last fighters broke off, the sky behind the bomber was littered with smoke trails and falling wreckage. The B-24 limped onward, scarred but flying. Inside, no one spoke for a long moment. They all knew something unprecedented had just occurred, not just a successful defense, but a demonstration of control. And as the bomber droned toward its target, the weight of that realization settled in. This wasn't luck. This was a method. And it was about to be tested again, under even heavier fire. This time, the warning was shorter. The call over the intercom was clipped, almost resigned. Contacts high. 12 o'clock. Multiple. The bomber formation was already stretched thin. Fuel burn had lightened the aircraft, but damage from the first engagement had compromised speed and cohesion. The formation could not tighten further without risking collision. Above them, the sky was suddenly alive. Japanese fighters dropped out of the sun in coordinated arcs, not the probing attacks of earlier, but a committed strike. They had learned. They were angry. And they were coming in numbers. The waist gunner felt the shift immediately. This was no longer a test. This was a decision point. He checked his belt without looking. He knew it by memory now, where the first tracer sat, how many ball rounds followed, where the final cluster waited. His hands moved with calm precision that surprised even him. The first fighter dove fast, guns flashing. The bomber shuddered as rounds punched through skin and frame. The smell of burning insulation filled the air. Still, he waited. The fighter passed beneath him, too fast, too low. Another replaced it instantly, climbing hard from below the left wing. This one was closer. Closer than before. The gunner fired a short burst. No tracer. The rounds struck the wing root. The aircraft jerked sideways, lost lift, and vanished in a corkscrew of smoke. A second fighter followed almost immediately, this one smarter, firing from range. Tracers stitched the air around the waist position. Plexiglass cracked. A fragment tore through the gunner's sleeve, hot and sharp. Pain registered distantly. He ignored it. He waited again. The enemy pilot saw nothing coming. He pressed his attack, confident the gun had jammed or the gunner was wounded. The first tracer appeared just as the fighter entered lethal range. Too late. The aircraft disintegrated mid-roll. At that moment, something changed in the behavior of the attackers. They began firing from farther out, less accurate, more desperate. Their passes grew shallow and rushed. They no longer lingered. Fear had crossed the cockpit gap. The sky, moments earlier full of motion, began to empty. When the last fighter broke off, the bomber was alone again, limping but alive. Inside, the crew sat in stunned silence. The adrenaline drained slowly, leaving behind shaking hands and ringing ears. The flight engineer finally spoke. "Jesus, what were you doing back there?" The gunner didn't answer right away. He looked at the ammunition feed. Nearly empty now. Just a few rounds left. The last tracer sat exactly where he'd planned it. "I was waiting," he said quietly. No one asked what he meant. When they landed hours later, ground crews counted the damage. Dozens of holes. Shrapnel scars. A fuel line nearly severed. A miracle they made it back. Debriefing officers listened carefully as the crew described the engagement. They wrote notes. They nodded. They asked about distances, timing, patterns. But when the subject of ammunition loading came up, the room shifted. "That's not standard," one officer said. The gunner shrugged. It worked. There was a pause. A long one. Nothing more was said. No commendation was issued. No reprimand either. But word spread quietly among crews. Some listened. Some didn't. Some tried and failed. Others adapted it to their own style. The official manuals never changed. But in the sky, things were different now. Fighters hesitated longer. Attacks came from farther out. Some pilots broke off without firing at all. The bomber crews felt it. They didn't know the science behind it. They didn't need to. They knew that something about the rules had shifted. And at the center of that shift was one gunner, one belt of ammunition, and a simple realization: fear could be shaped. The mission ended. The war went on. But the lesson remained: quiet, uncelebrated, and lethal. The bomber landed just before dusk, its tires screeching against the coral runway as ground crews rushed forward. The aircraft looked like a survivor pulled from wreckage: punctured skin, oil streaks, scorched metal. Yet it had returned. That fact alone placed the mission among the fortunate. The debriefing that followed was procedural on the surface, but tense underneath. Intelligence officers asked their questions in careful order. Altitude. Heading. Enemy count. Engagement range. Ammunition expenditure. When the waist gunner described the engagement, the room grew quieter than usual. Not because of exaggeration, he didn't embellish, but because of precision. He spoke in distances, timing, angles. He described waiting instead of reacting. He described firing only when the geometry was perfect. Some officers exchanged glances. Others scribbled notes. No one interrupted. When the subject of ammunition configuration arose, the air shifted. "That's not standard loading," one officer finally said. "No, sir," the gunner replied. "But it works." There was a pause long enough to feel deliberate. The officer closed his notebook. "We'll review it." That was the end of it. No commendation followed. No official endorsement. No citation appeared in unit records describing a revolutionary technique. The Army Air Forces did not like unsanctioned methods, especially ones that implied existing doctrine had limits. But war does not wait for approval. In the days that followed, word spread quietly along the flight line. Gunners talked in fragments, about waiting longer, about holding fire, about confusing enemy pilots rather than overwhelming them. Some dismissed it as luck. Others listened carefully. A few tried it. Not all succeeded. The method demanded discipline few possessed. Waiting until the last moment required absolute confidence and nerve. Some gunners fired too late. Some froze. Some reverted to panic when rounds came too close. But those who mastered it noticed something unmistakable. Enemy fighters hesitated. They approached more cautiously. They broke off earlier. They fired from farther away. Attacks became less coordinated, more scattered. The sky felt different. It wasn't that Japanese pilots suddenly lost skill or courage. It was that one of their assumptions, that tracer fire meant danger and silence meant safety, had been quietly undermined. Intelligence reports began reflecting this shift. Intercepts noted increasing standoff attacks. Fighter pilots complained of uncertainty during bomber engagements. Some units reported declining effectiveness in close-range interception. No one drew a straight line back to a single waist gunner. But patterns were forming. Meanwhile, the man at the center of it all returned to flying. Mission after mission. Each one carried the same risk. Each one demanded the same restraint. He did not seek attention. He did not teach classes. He did not write reports. He simply loaded his ammunition the same way and trusted his judgment. Over time, the war moved on. New aircraft arrived. New tactics emerged. Radar improved. Fighter escorts extended their range. The nature of aerial combat shifted once again. The small window in which his technique mattered began to close. But during that window, brief, violent, and unforgiving, it had saved lives. Not only his own. Crewmen from other aircraft spoke of returning with fewer holes. Of attacks that broke early. Of moments when the enemy seemed uncertain. No one could prove why. But many suspected. And somewhere in the Pacific, amid the noise of engines and the constant churn of war, a simple truth lingered. Sometimes the most dangerous weapon was not the one that fired first, but the one that waited. As the war pressed on into late 1944 and 1945, the tempo of air combat in the Pacific shifted once again. American industrial output surged. Fighter escorts ranged farther. Radar coverage improved. Japanese aviation, once aggressive and adaptive, began to thin under the weight of attrition and fuel shortages. The environment that had allowed one gunner's quiet innovation to matter began to close. But its effects lingered longer than anyone realized. Within bomber groups, unofficial knowledge circulated the way it always had, through conversations on hard bunks, whispered exchanges during maintenance, quick comments before takeoff. The language was vague. No one described it as doctrine. It was simply waiting longer, or not showing your hand. Some gunners tried it once and abandoned it. Others found that it demanded a kind of emotional control they didn't possess. A few adopted fragments of it without understanding the full reasoning behind it. The method was never standardized. It never appeared in training manuals or tactical summaries. That was partly because it resisted standardization. It depended on timing, perception, and judgment, qualities that could not be reliably taught in a classroom. High command moved on to bigger problems: escort integration, long-range bombing strategy, preparing for the invasion of Japan. Individual gunner innovations did not fit neatly into operational planning. The man who started it all remained largely anonymous. He completed his tour. He flew his final missions. He rotated home. There were no parades, no headlines, no formal recognition for the subtle shift he had helped create. His service record looked like thousands of others: missions flown, decorations earned, a quiet discharge into civilian life. Like many veterans, he spoke little about the war afterward. When asked, he described the noise, the cold, the waiting. He did not talk about the moments when he chose not to fire. Those moments belonged to him alone. In later years, historians and analysts would study Pacific air combat with growing sophistication. They would note changes in engagement distances. They would observe shifts in Japanese tactics. They would debate causes: fuel shortages, pilot training, mechanical fatigue. A few would mention psychological factors. Fewer still would mention individual gunners. But the pattern was there, embedded in after-action reports and mission logs. A subtle change in how bomber formations were approached, a hesitation that had not existed before. It was not a revolution. It was an evolution. One born not from orders, but from experience. The war ended, as all wars do, not with clarity but with exhaustion. And when peace came, The story of that gunner faded into the background noise of history, overshadowed by larger battles, louder heroes, and more dramatic narratives. Yet his contribution remained real. He had proven that warfare was not only about machines or numbers, but perception. That dominance could be achieved not only through firepower, but through understanding the mind of the enemy. And that sometimes, the smallest deviation from the rulebook could change the rhythm of a fight. A lesson learned quietly, at altitude, between the roar of engines and the silence between bursts. War often remembers its turning points as explosions, beaches taken, cities burned, flags raised or lowered. But many of its true pivots are quieter. They happen in moments without witnesses, without orders, without ceremony. They happen inside the mind of one person forced to decide how to survive the next few seconds. The story of this gunner is not about heroism in the traditional sense. It is about perception, about understanding that war is not only a contest of machines, but of expectations, of fear, of habits learned and relied upon until someone notices the pattern underneath. His innovation was not technological. It was psychological. He did not build a new weapon. He simply understood what the enemy believed to be true, and chose to betray that belief at exactly the right moment. In doing so, he revealed something uncomfortable about warfare. That doctrine, no matter how carefully designed, is always incomplete. It cannot account for the infinite variations of human behavior under stress. Manuals can teach procedures, but they cannot teach judgment. They cannot teach when to wait. The Pacific War was filled with men like him, individuals whose contributions were too small, too situational, or too unofficial to become legend. Yet together, they shaped outcomes just as surely as admirals and generals did. His story reminds us that progress in war often comes not from invention, but from attention, from watching carefully, from noticing what others overlook, from understanding that sometimes the most powerful action is restraint. In the end, the sky closed over the Pacific. The bombers returned. The war moved on. But for a brief stretch of time, in the thin air between life and death, one man learned how to weaponize silence, and in doing so, rewrote the rules of survival for those who flew beside him. That is how wars are truly changed. Not always by orders shouted from command tents, but by quiet decisions made in the space between heartbeats.